Chapter 1, Part 1 of The Gold Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Gold Hunters by J.D. Borthwick. Chapter 1, Part 1. On to the Goldfields. About the beginning of the year 1851, the rage for emigration to California from the United States was at its height. All sorts and conditions of men, old, young, and middle-aged, allured by the hope of acquiring sudden wealth, and fascinated with the adventure and excitement of a life in California, were relinquishing their existing pursuits and associations to commence a totally new existence in the land of gold. The rush of eager gold hunters was so great that the Panama Steamship Company's office in New York used to be perfectly mobbed for a day and a night previous to the day appointed for selling tickets for their steamers. Sailing vessels were dispatched for Chagres almost daily, carrying crowds of passengers, while numbers went by the different routes through Mexico, and others chose the easier but more tedious passage around Cape Horn. The emigration from the western states was naturally very large, the inhabitants being a class of men whose lives are spent in clearing the wild forests of the west, and gradually driving the Indian from his hunting ground. Of these western frontier men, it is often said that they are never satisfied if there is any white man between them and sundown. They are constantly moving westward, for as the wild Indian is forced to retire before them, so they, in their turn, shrinking from the signs of civilization which their own labors cause to appear around them, have to plunge deeper into the forest in search of that wild border life which has such charms for all who have ever experienced it. To men of this sort, the accounts of such a country as California, thousands of miles to the westward of them, were peculiarly attractive, and so great was the emigration that many parts of the western states were nearly depopulated. The route followed by these people was overland, across the plains, which was the most congenial to their tastes, and the most convenient for them, as besides, being already so far to the westward, they were also provided with the necessary wagons and oxen for the journey. For the sake of mutual protection against the Indians, they traveled in trains of a dozen or more wagons, carrying the women and children and provisions, accompanied by a proportionate number of men, some on horses or mules, and others on foot. In May 1851, I happened to be residing in New York, and was seized with the California fever. My preparations were very soon made, and a day or two afterwards I found myself on board a small bark about to sail for Chagres with a load of California emigrants. Our vessel was little more than 200 tons, and was entirely devoted to the accommodation of passengers. The ballast was covered with a temporary deck, and the whole interior of the ship formed a saloon, round which were built 3 tiers of berths. A very rough extempore table and benches completed the furniture. There was no invidious distinction of cabin and steerage passengers. In fact, excepting the captain's room, there was nothing which could be called a cabin in the ship. But all were in good spirits, and so much engrossed with thoughts of California that there was little disposition to grumble at the rough and ready style of our accommodation. For my part, I knew I should have to rough it in California, and felt that I might just as well begin at once as wait till I got there. We numbered about 60 passengers, and a nice assortment we were. The majority, of course, were Americans, and were from all parts of the Union. The rest were English, French, and German. We had representatives of nearly every trade, besides farmers, engineers, lawyers, doctors, merchants, and nondescript young men. The first day out we had fine weather, with just sea enough to afford the uninitiated an opportunity of discovering the difference between the lee and the weather side of the ship. The second day we had a fresh breeze, which towards night blew a gale, and for a couple of days we were compelled to lay to. The greater number of the passengers, being from the interior of the country, had never seen the ocean before, and a gale of wind was a thing they did not understand at all. Those who were not too sick to be able to form an opinion on the subject were frightened out of their senses, and imagined that all manner of dreadful things were going to happen to the ship. The first night of the gale I was awakened by an old fool shouting frantically to the company in general to get up and save the ship, because he heard the water rushing into her, and we should sink in a few minutes. He was very emphatically cursed for his trouble by those whose slumbers he had disturbed, and told to hold his tongue, and let those sleep who could, if he were unable to do so himself. It was certainly, however, not very easy to sleep that night. The ship was very crank, and but few of the party had taken the precaution to make fast their luggage. The consequence was that boxes and chests of all sizes, besides casks of provisions and other ship's stores which had got adrift, were cruising about promiscuously, threatening to smash up the flimsy framework on which our berths were built, and endangering the limbs of anyone who should venture to turn out. In the morning we found that the cook's galley had fetched way, and the stove was rendered useless. The steward and waiters, landlubbers who were only working their passage to Chagres, were as sick as the sickest, and so the prospect for breakfast was by no means encouraging. However, there were not more than half a dozen of us who could eat anything, or could even stand on deck, so we roughed it out on cold beef, hard bread, and brandy and water. The sea was not very high, and the ship lay to comfortably and dry, but in the evening some of the poor wretches below had worked themselves up to desperation, being sure every time the ship laid over that she was never coming up again. At last one man, who could stand it no longer, jumped out of his berth, and, going down on his knees, commenced clapping his hands and uttering the most dismal howls and groans, interspersed with disjointed fragments of prayers. He called on all hands to join him, but it was not a form of worship to which many seemed to be accustomed, for only 2 men responded to his call. He very kindly consigned all the rest of the company to a place which I trust none of us may reach, and prayed that for the sake of the 3 righteous men, himself and the other 2, the ship might be saved. They continued for about an hour, clapping their hands as if applauding, and crying and groaning most piteously, so bereft of sense by fear that they seemed not to know the meaning of their incoherent exclamations. The captain, however, at last succeeded in persuading them that there was no danger, and they gradually cooled down, to the great relief of the rest of the passengers. The next day we had better weather, but the sick list was as large as ever, and we had to mess again on whatever raw materials we could lay our hands on: red herrings, onions, ham, and biscuit. We deposed the steward as a useless vagabond, and appointed 3 passengers to fill his place, after which we fared a little better, in fact, as well as the provisions at our command would allow. No one grumbled except a few of the lowest class of men in the party, who had very likely never been used to such good living ashore. When we got into the trade winds, we had delightful weather, very hot, but with a strong breeze at night, rendering it sufficiently cool to sleep in comfort. The all-engrossing subject of conversation and of meditation was, of course, California, and the heaps of gold we were all to find there. As we had secured our passage only as far as Chagres, our progress from that point to San Francisco was also a matter of constant discussion. We all knew that every steamer to leave Panama for months to come was already full, and that hundreds of men were waiting there to take advantage of any opportunity that might occur of reaching San Francisco. But among our passengers there were very few who were traveling in company. They were mostly all isolated individuals, each on his own hook, and every one was perfectly confident that he, at least, would have no trouble in getting along, whatever might be the fate of the rest of the crowd. We added to the delicacies of our bill of fare occasionally by killing dolphins. They are very good eating, and afford capital sport. They come in small shoals of a dozen or so, and amuse themselves by playing about before the bows of the vessel, when, getting down into the martingale under the bowsprit, one takes the opportunity to let drive at them with the grains, a small 5-pronged harpoon. The dolphin, by the way, is most outrageously and systematically libeled. Instead of being the horrid, big-headed, crooked-backed monster which it is generally represented, it is the most elegant and highly finished fish that swims. For 3 or 4 days before reaching Chagres, all hands were busy packing up and firing off and reloading pistols, for a revolver and a bowie knife were considered the first items in a California outfit. We soon assumed a warlike appearance, and though many of the party had probably never handled a pistol in their lives before, they tried to wear their weapons in a negligee style, as if they never had been used to go without them. There were now also great consultations as to what sort of hats, coats, and boots should be worn in crossing the Isthmus. Wondrous accounts constantly appeared in the New York papers of the dangers and difficulties of these few miles of land and river travel, and most of the passengers, before leaving New York, had been humbugged into buying all manner of absurd and useless articles, many of them made of India rubber, which they had been assured, and consequently believed, were absolutely necessary. But how to carry them all, or even how to use them, was the main difficulty, and would indeed have puzzled much cleverer men. Some were equipped with pots, pans, kettles, drinking cups, knives and forks, spoons, pocket filters, for they had been told that the water on the Isthmus was very dirty, India rubber contrivances, which an ingenious man with a powerful imagination and strong lungs could blow up and convert into a bed, a boat, or a tent, bottles of cholera preventive, boxes of pills for curing every disease to which the human nature is liable, and some men, in addition to all this, determined to be prepared to combat danger in every shape, bade defiance to the waters of the Chagres River by buckling on India rubber life preservers. Others of the party, who were older travelers, and who held all such accoutrements in utter contempt, had merely a small valise with a few necessary articles of clothing, an oilskin coat, and very probably a pistol stowed away on some part of their person, which would be pretty sure to go off when occasion required, but not before. At last, after 20 days' passage from New York, we made Chagres, and got up into the anchorage towards evening. The scenery was very beautiful. We lay about 3/4 of a mile from shore, in a small bay enclosed by high bluffs, completely covered with dense foliage of every shade of green. We had but little time, however, to enjoy the scenery that evening, as we had scarcely anchored when the rain began to come down in true tropical style. Every drop was a bucketful. The thunder and lightning were terrific, and in good keeping with the rain, which is one of the things for which Chagres is celebrated. Its character as a sickly, wretched place was so well known that none of us went ashore that night. We all preferred sleeping aboard ship. It was very amusing to watch the change which had been coming over some of the men on board. They seemed to shrink within themselves, and to wish to avoid being included in any of the small parties which were being formed to make the passage up the river. They were those who had provided themselves with innumerable contrivances for the protection of their precious persons against sun, wind, and rain, also with extraordinary assortments of very untempting looking provisions, and who were completely equipped with pistols, knives, and other warlike implements. They were like so many Robinson Crusoes, ready to be put ashore on a desert island, and they seemed to imagine themselves to be in just such a predicament, fearful at the same time that companionship with anyone not provided with the same amount of rubbish as themselves might involve their losing the exclusive benefit of what they supposed as absolutely necessary. I actually heard one of them refuse another man a chew of tobacco, saying he guessed he had no more than he could use himself. The men of this sort, of whom I am happy to say there were not many, offered a striking contrast to the rest in another respect. On arriving at Chagres, they became quite dejected and sulky, and seemed to be oppressed with anxiety, while the others were in a wild state of delight at having finished a tedious passage, and in anticipation of the novelty and excitement of crossing the Isthmus. In the morning, several shore boats, all pulled by Americans, came off to take us ashore. The landing here is rather dangerous. There is generally a very heavy swell, causing vessels to roll so much that getting into a small boat alongside is a matter of considerable difficulty, and at the mouth of the river is a bar, on which are immense rollers, requiring good management to get over them in safety. We went ashore in torrents of rain, and when landed with our baggage on the muddy bank of the Chagres River, all as wet as if we had swum ashore. We were immediately beset by crowds of boatmen, Americans, natives, and Jamaica niggers, all endeavoring to make a bargain with us for the passage up the river to Cruces. The town of Chagres is built on each side of the river, and consists of a few miserable cane and mud huts, with one or two equally wretched-looking wooden houses, which were hotels kept by Americans. On the top of the bluff, on the south side of the river, are the ruins of an old Spanish castle, which look very picturesque, almost concealed by the luxurious growth of trees and creepers around them. The natives seem to be a miserable set of people, and the few Americans in the town were most sickly, washed-out looking objects, with the appearance of having been steeped for a length of time in water. After breakfasting on ham and beans at one of the hotels, we selected a boat to convey us up the river, and as the owner had no crew engaged, we got him to take 2 sailors who had run away from our vessel and were bound for California like the rest of us. There was a great variety of boats employed on the river: whale boats, ship's boats, skiffs, and canoes of all sizes, some of them capable of carrying 15 or 20 people. It was still raining heavily when we started, but shortly afterwards the weather cleared up, and we felt in a better humor to enjoy the magnificent scenery. The river was from 75 to 100 yards wide, and the banks were completely hidden by the dense mass of vegetation overhanging the water. There was a vast variety of beautiful foliage, and many of the trees were draped in creepers, covered with large flowers of most brilliant colors. One of our party, who was a Scotch gardener, was in ecstasies at such a splendid natural flower show, and gave us long Latin names for all the different specimens. The rest of my fellow passengers were a big fat man from Buffalo, 2 young Southerners from South Carolina, 3 New Yorkers, and a Swede. The boat was rather heavily laden, but for some hours we got along very well, as there was but little current. Towards the afternoon, however, our 2 sailors, who had been pulling all the time, began to flag, and at last said they could go no further without a rest. We were still many miles from the place where we were to pass the night, and as the banks of the river presented such a formidable barricade of jungle as to prevent a landing, we had the prospect of passing the night in the boat, unless we made the most of our time, so the gardener and I volunteered to take a spell at the oars. But as we ascended the river, the current became much stronger, and darkness overtook us some distance from our intended stopping place. It became so very dark that we could not see 6 feet ahead of us, and were constantly bumping against other boats coming up the river. There were also many boats coming down with the current at such a rate that if one had happened to run into us, we should have had but a poor chance, and we were obliged to keep shouting all the time to let our whereabouts be known. We were several times nearly capsized on snags, and as we really could not see whether we were making any way or not, we came to the determination of making fast to a tree till the moon should rise. It was now raining again as heavily as ever, and having fully expected to make the station that evening, we had taken no provisions with us. We were all very wet, very hungry, and more or less inclined to be in a bad humor. Consequently, the question of stopping or going ahead was not determined without a great deal of wrangling and discussion. However, our 2 sailors declared they would not pull another stroke. The gardener and myself were in favor of stopping, and as none of the rest of our number were at all inclined to exert themselves, the question was thus settled for them, although they continued to discuss it for their own satisfaction for some time afterwards. It was about 8 o'clock when, catching hold of a bough of a tree 12 or 15 feet from the shore, we made fast. We could not attempt to land, as the shore was so guarded by bushes and sunken branches as to render the nearer approach of the boat impossible. So here we were, 13 of us, with a proportionate pile of baggage, cramped up in a small boat in which we had spent the day, and were now doomed to pass the night, our miseries aggravated by torrents of rain, nothing to eat, and worse than that, nothing to drink, but worse than all, without even a dry match wherewith to light a pipe. If ever it is excusable to chew tobacco, it surely is on such an occasion as this. I had worked a good deal at the oar, and from the frequent alternations we had experienced of scorching heat and drenching rain, I felt as if I could enjoy a nap, notwithstanding the disagreeableness of our position; but fearing the consequences of sleeping under such circumstances in that climate, I kept myself awake the best way I could. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.